Good evening. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for the program this evening. My name is Michael Scott, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group. As a member of the SAB, I get access to many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you're a KU student and are interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. For this evening's event, if you would like to know more about our guest, the event itself, upcoming Institute events, and more, you can download a printable program handout. The link is in the YouTube event description below. This evening's event features a virtual book sale of our guest's book, The Age of Eisenhower. You can find more information on how to purchase this book in the YouTube event description below. At the end of this evening's event, we will have time for you to ask questions of our guests. Please type your question in the YouTube chat box on your screen. Please hold all questions until the end of the program. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Questions that are distracting, disrespectful, or attempt to dominate the chat will be deleted and the user will be removed. This evening's program is closed captioned for the hearing impaired. And now, please join me in welcoming Director of the Institute, Bill Lacey.
Michael, thank you very much for that welcome. It's greatly appreciated. I want to welcome all of our audience who are watching tonight's program. I want to give some thank yous at the beginning. I want to thank Professor Beth Bailey at the University of Kansas for suggesting the program and hooking me up with our special guest tonight. Beth, thanks a lot. Hope you're watching. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Departments of History at KU and the Department of Political Science, also at KU. I want to remind everyone that what Michael mentioned is true. If you're interested in buying a copy of our book tonight, you can find the information on how to buy it on this YouTube page, and you can also get a signed book plate if you just follow the directions on the YouTube page. Now it's my great honor to introduce our Chancellor, Chancellor Doug Girod. Chancellor.
Hello, my name is Doug Girod, and I'm the Chancellor here at the University of Kansas. We are pleased to welcome Dr. William Hitchcock to the Dole Institute of Politics this evening. Dr. Hitchcock is the William W. Corcoran Professor of History at the University of Virginia, and his work and teaching focus on the global history of the 20th century, and in particular, the era of the two world wars and the Cold War. His latest book, The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s, is a New York Times bestseller. It has also been hailed as a definitive account of this deeply loved president's life. President Eisenhower was a fellow Kansan and a personal hero to Senator Bob Dole. In recent years, Senator Dole spearheaded the effort to build a monument to President Eisenhower. Dr. Hitchcock spoke at the dedication of the new Dwight D. Eisenhower Monument in Washington, D.C. last month. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Will Hitchcock.
Will, welcome to the Dole Institute. It's great to have you here tonight. Let's start. Let me ask you about your upbringing and your education.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to the Dole Institute. This is a delight, a pleasure. You know, I've been talking about Eisenhower for a couple of years now to public audiences, but it really feels meaningful to be speaking to a group in Kansas. I mean, that's really the whole story about Eisenhower and his beginning. But as for me, well, you ask about my upbringing. My dad was a Foreign Service officer in the age of Eisenhower, as a matter of fact, in the 1950s. And as a young, idealistic man out of college, he joined the Foreign Service, went to the State Department, and was sent in the late 50s to Vietnam, of all places. Knew nothing about Southeast Asia, but there he went, and he was there not as a soldier, but as a public servant trying to, as he put it, tell America's story to the world, which was what the US Information Agency that he had just joined was supposed to do. I was then born not in Vietnam, but in Japan, because my dad and my mother went to Japan after they left Vietnam on another assignment. So I had the great good fortune, it didn't seem that way to me as a kid, but the great good fortune I realize now to be born overseas and then to travel as a young person and see the wider world and really to see how the rest of the world views America from the outside in. It was an extraordinary privilege. And also, I'll just say that my father was, still is at the age of 92, an unbelievable public servant, somebody who believed in serving the country, serving government, and he made a career doing that. Never cynical, never tired, always optimistic, even when times were terrible, as they often have been, ups and downs. Well, I went on to college in Ohio. I went to graduate school at Yale University, and I've been moving up and down the East Coast, teaching at a number of different institutions since then. I love history. I'm married to a historian, so we impose it on our kids a good deal as well. And now I'm here in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia, and it's just an amazing place to be a historian.
Yes, UVA has an extraordinary reputation. Could you tell us why you wrote this book? There have been a lot of books written about Ike. Why all this time later did you decide to write this particular book?
Well, it really emerged from the book that I had completed just before this one. So the book that I had finished before this one was called Liberation, or The Bitter Road to Freedom. And it was really a book about the year 1944 and 1945 during the Allied liberation of Western Europe. And it was a ground level view, a grassroots view of the struggle of the Allied armies and the West European people as they fought in that terrible, bitter last year of the war for their freedom. And I wanted to capture the surprises, the untold stories of the people on the ground meeting up with American and British soldiers as they came bashing into the coast of France, of Normandy, and then as they fought their way up the coast and then into Belgium and into the Netherlands and then finally into Germany. And I wanted to try to describe just how difficult that last year was, how much sacrifice the soldiers gave, but also the terrible civilian experience of the last year of the war. Well, in all of this, of course, there was one man sort of in the background looking over it all, and that was General Eisenhower. And I kept on saying to myself, I'm doing this at the grassroots level, but I'm not focusing on leaders, but I'd like to come back to leadership. I'd like to come back to Eisenhower at another time. And in talking to my editor, he said, your book about the liberation is a good read, but it's pretty depressing. maybe you can lift us up a little bit, find something admirable to write about. And it occurred to me that a biography of Eisenhower would be terrific, but really the piece of his life we understood the least was his presidency, as opposed to the 3 years in which he was Supreme Allied Commander, which I think had been done very, very well. And so I was interested in the challenge. I teach about the Cold War, and I did feel that we didn't really have a good read on Eisenhower's presidency, his leadership in the Cold War, especially his domestic politics. And to the extent that people had written about it, they focused just on the first couple of years. Honestly, so little really had been written about the latter years of his 8 years in office. So I looked at it the way most historians do. Here's an opportunity to say something new, something fresh, and I dug in. And it was much more difficult than I had expected, because the range of his experiences, the significance of his career was so enormous.
Mm-hmm. How did Eisenhower's early life and his early military experience shape his presidency?
Well, there's two questions. The early life in Kansas, Abilene, in West Point, and then in the interwar army shaped his life enormously. I mean, Abilene is so much a part of who he was, his character. He grew up poor. I mean, I think this is just something we have to hang a lantern on. I mean, he didn't know it, as he liked to say. We were poor, but we didn't know it. But he grew up without any safety net. He grew up in a large family. I mean, your listeners know all this: 6 boys and the Eisenhowers living out in the plains and in central Kansas, farming family working at the creamery there, the dairy in Abilene. I mean, they knew no security, no luxuries, but it didn't really occur to them that there was an alternative life that rich people led. And I think that that grounding in a place, in a family, in a religion, a faith, a deep faith, the River Brethren community in Abilene, to me, that's central to understanding Eisenhower's self-confidence. He knew exactly who he was. He never doubted where he came from. He was never ashamed about where he came from. Of course, he would go there to be buried and build his libraries there. So Abilene and was his identity. And we were talking just a little bit beforehand about, well, what if he put his presidential library at Gettysburg? Well, that's an interesting counterfactual, how it might change scholars' view of him. They would have gone to Gettysburg much more readily, but it never would have occurred to Eisenhower because Abilene was so much a part of him. As for how the war shaped his presidency, goodness gracious, it shaped it overwhelmingly because, of course, he was a professional military man. He had come up through the Army. He had been, you know, in a sense, sidelined, missing combat in World War I, and then serving as a desk officer for some of the leading intellectuals of the interwar Army, Fox Connor and of course Douglas MacArthur. And I think that you know, when he finally gets the big command job, he's sent by George Marshall, sent off to London to run the European Theater of Operations. He's still an unknown figure. He's not at all known in the country. He's not very well known in the Army. And those 3 years transforms Eisenhower. It transforms his reputation, transforms the armed forces of the United States. It transforms America's place in the world. Those 3 years between 1942, when Ike gets to London, and the end of the war, 1945. So what did he learn? I mean, goodness, I could go on and I won't, but you know, he learned, first of all, the value of failure. You know, Eisenhower's record of command in North Africa and Italy was not flawless. I mean, the American Army struggled. It had to learn on the job. Now, North Africa was kind of a mess. Italy wasn't much better. Eisenhower could easily have been cashiered in the middle of the Italian campaign. It wasn't going particularly well. He learned how to deal with headstrong subordinates. I mean, goodness, General Montgomery, General Allenbrook of the British, on the British side. You know, you got Patton over here on the others, you know, Bradley. Of course, he had to deal with the president, with Franklin Roosevelt, who was a wily and sometimes difficult man to pin down. He spent a lot of time dealing, of course, with Winston Churchill, a man of extraordinary, you know, political genius and ego. And they fought a lot about the direction of the war. You put all this together and you realize, you know, just dealing with the personalities alone might have given anybody a heart attack, but he also had to then organize, you know, the logistics behind the great invasion of 1944. And that was a 2-year plan. And the amount of effort, the struggle, the perseverance that was required, the managing of a multinational coalition, the sense of leadership, not worrying about the small things, delegating, all of these things, meeting with the press, handling the press and talking to them in a way that was, you know, he confided in them, but he really didn't tell them anything. Boy, by the time he got out of World War II, he was completely ready for a political career. And I think that the war also, of course, you know, as a moral cause, as a cause about what it takes to sustain freedom. Of course, it defined not just him, but a whole generation of Americans. So the whole Eisenhower story is fundamentally about taking the lessons of World War II and operationalizing them in the post-war period.
Let me ask a question about presidential surveys. You know, there's these different groups that survey historians and ask them to rank presidents. And one survey that we came across in particular ranked Eisenhower 22 out of 31 presidents in 1962, which is a very mediocre rating. And yet that same particular survey today ranks him 5th out of 45. What changed?
Yeah, that's an interesting development. And I think the goalpost changed a little bit. So Eisenhower's reputation has increased, but I also think that the methodology changed. So that first poll that you referenced was conducted by Arthur M. Schlesinger Sr., not the Kennedy speechwriter, but the father of that man, who was a Harvard professor. And he basically polled other, you know, friends of Schlesinger. So it was a somewhat biased group of historians commenting upon the historians. They were very pro-democratic, pro-Kennedy, and Eisenhower, you know, got a very, very low mark in that survey in the 60s. But the methodology of the most recent poll that you cite, which was a 2017 poll, I think, and is a much more sophisticated one. A much broader range of people are sampled, and they're asked to evaluate presidents upon 10 different categories. You know, their integrity and their financial, the leadership of the budget, a variety of other topics, their foreign policy, the domestic policy, and so forth. And what's interesting is that in each of these categories, Eisenhower got consistently high marks. So whereas one president might do well in foreign policy but poorly in domestic politics, Eisenhower could be seen as doing well in all of these categories. So he came out very high, but also I think other presidents have been slumping lately. So Andrew Jackson has come under a lot of criticism. Woodrow Wilson has come under a lot of criticism. Even, dare I say, John Kennedy slipped a little bit. So I think what's happened is Eisenhower's virtues, both as president managing the presidency, but also his personal character, has started to elevate his reputation. We've come now to see him as one of the leading figures of American political history, which if you had told the Schlesingers back in the 60s that would happen, they would have literally fallen out of their chair. So it's a wonderful story, a wonderful development of changing perspectives.
Definitely. Why was Eisenhower pretty consistently underestimated?
Well, you know, it's funny. The people who knew him best, of course, not for 1 second underestimated him. And I would just say that to me, as a historian who I'd not worked on Eisenhower in depth coming into this topic, I probably underestimated him. Before I began this research, I probably had bought into some of the stories that he played a lot of golf, that he got lucky. There was a lot of peace in the 1950s. He didn't have to work very hard. You know, things were kind of quiet. Everybody was rich. There really wasn't much to do as president. Well, the people who were close to Eisenhower never underestimated his character, his discipline, his intelligence. One of the things that I learned about when writing this book is that Eisenhower was an extraordinarily intelligent man, just you know, just in terms of his pure IQ. But I also think that that was a condescending view of some in the media that, in a sense, you know, saw Eisenhower. You know, Eisenhower was just really good at being president. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. He managed to project an air of calm, of unflappability, of seriousness, of purpose, so that in times of crisis, it made it look like he knew what he was doing. He never had to sweat too hard. I think that worked against him in some ways. You know, the portrait of him was as a man who wasn't working very hard, but that's a complete myth that was easy to explode once you got into the documents and saw his fingerprints on every aspect of politics and policy. So interesting story. What, you know, he was underestimated in part because he made the presidency look kind of easy.
That's fascinating. Can you talk about his presidency's impact on U.S. military and foreign policy?
Well, golly, in terms of foreign policy, the critical thing to remember about Ike is that he's president during the hottest period of the Cold War. You know, I would also include the Cuban Missile Crisis, which isn't his era, but the 1950s is arguably the hottest period. There's open warfare in Korea when he comes into office. There are a series of crises in Indochina and Taiwan, over Berlin. There's a period of, you know, Stalin's death in 1953. Nobody knows what that's going to lead to. This is soon after the communist revolution in China. Nobody really knows what that's going to mean for world affairs. So Eisenhower comes into a very dynamic, dangerous world atmosphere. He brings on board John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State. I think that was a mistake. Dulles was unimaginative. He was a profound hawk. He was the sort of hawkish establishment figure. He was very loyal to Eisenhower, but he didn't allow Eisenhower's, you know, creativity perhaps to blossom in the way that I think it might have done had he brought in a somewhat less doctrinaire Secretary of State. But nonetheless, his overwhelming achievement, and he would have said this, he did say this as president, was to maintain the peace. And he didn't do it peacefully, if you know what I mean. He developed the tools of deterrence, and he built, to your second question, an enormous military apparatus. So one of the things that surprised me in this book, and we can talk about his farewell address, the military industrial complex speech, But Eisenhower, leaves office and says, watch out for the military-industrial complex. But Eisenhower did everything he possibly could to build it. What a paradox. So to your question, what impact did it have on the military? Eisenhower's leadership somewhat transferred the weight of American military power away from conventional military apparatus of the kind that had fought in World War II and was fighting in Korea. And he updated it for the nuclear age, put much greater emphasis on nuclear weapons. He built the strategic triad, if you like, the land-based missiles, the submarine-based missiles, the Air Force, all of which were nuclear equipped by the time he left office. So he really profoundly transformed the American military power in the world. And he did it in order to maintain the peace, in order to deter the Soviets, as he understood it, from taking any risks. So your question goes right to the heart of his principal achievement. In foreign policy, he wanted to try to avoid conflict and maintain peace, but he did it by building an extraordinarily powerful military apparatus that he felt could deter American rivals.
How did he maintain the balance there, though, Will, of, on the one hand, you're talking about the military industrial complex and he's building, this incredible American war machine. And on the other hand, he had a pretty restrained and pretty cautious foreign policy. How did he manage that balance?
Well, it was something that he thought a great deal about. And, he came into office and he said, we have got to avoid becoming a garrison state. He said it would be the easiest thing in the world for us to build ourselves along the lines of what he imagined the Soviet Union was doing, which was channeling all of their resources into the military. He said, in a free society, we can't afford to do that. We have to maintain a small government. He thought of himself as a small government conservative. I don't think he really was, but he thought of himself that way. He did manage to balance the budget 3 times in the 8 years that he was in office. He significantly reduced spending initially from Korean War levels down to a somewhat more manageable figure. But there's a myth that Eisenhower slashed the military budget. In fact, he spent a great deal on the military throughout his 8 years in office. I calculated that it was about 10% of GDP on average throughout his 8 years in office. That's an enormous sum. Today we're at about 3.5. So Eisenhower was willing to try to strike a balance that favored limited government spending. In his view, that was crucial to maintaining a free economy. But at the same time, he never wanted to leave the United States unprepared. And that meant spending significantly on the military. I think that's very much the balance that's at the heart of that military industrial complex speech at the end, when he says it's about finding that balance and not letting the needs of the military overwhelm the civilian leaders. That's what he was afraid might happen to John Kennedy, who was coming into office with so little experience.
What would you, switching gears a little bit here, Professor, what would you say were Eisenhower's best domestic accomplishments?
Yes, well, it's a subject that people debate because he spent so much of his time on foreign affairs and international issues. For me, we haven't talked much about, I think, a number of central initiatives that matter to him a great deal. One is a boring topic, and that's infrastructure. And of course, people sort of roll their eyes and say infrastructure, that's not exciting. But actually, probably most of you all drove to wherever you drive today. You probably spent some time on an interstate. And the interstate's highway system was Eisenhower's probably most enduring, maybe not most passionate legacy, but most enduring legacy on domestic affairs. 40,000 miles of interstate highway were designed and planned and put into operation over the course of his presidency, and then subsequently, of course, we're still building out the highway system. That had a huge impact on the economy in terms of spending on infrastructure, on the car industry, the auto industry, the economy, and indeed later on the environment. So the consequences of the highway system is a very, very important one that I try to undermine. I tried to figure out a little bit in the book. But so that's the less exciting answer to your question. The more exciting answer to your question is the unpredictable and surprising developments that occurred in the field of civil rights during Eisenhower's presidency. Now, again, this is maybe not how he would have emphasized his greatest accomplishments, but in retrospect, I believe we can see progress on civil rights as one of the most enduring, maybe consequential results of his presidency. And I'll just say a few words about this because, it's so important. Ike had no idea what really the civil rights movement was about at all. He was not at all prepared to deal with the civil rights crisis of the 1950s. He had grown up in a segregated US Army. Many of his best friends were Army officers who'd spent a great deal of time in the South or were from the South. Where did Eisenhower spend most of his free time? On golf courses, many of which were in the South, Augusta National in Georgia especially, segregated. He had benefited from and grown up in and succeeded in a segregated America. So he was not the man you would have picked to make great strides on civil rights. But again and again and again, he surprises us in this field. And some people will say, that's balderdash. It was an accident. He backed into it. He doesn't get any credit. And I just totally disagree with that. He pushed forward the desegregation of Washington, D.C., which was still a segregated city when he became president. And we can thank Woodrow Wilson for that. He knowingly appointed Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I say knowingly, he knew his record on civil rights. He was a progressive on civil rights. His Attorney General, Herbert Brownell, helped him to craft the arguments that would be heard in the case of Brown versus Board before the Supreme Court. And that decision transformed the United States. It signaled a break with the past, break with Jim Crow, and it said public schools must be integrated. They cannot be segregated legally. Eisenhower was at times uncomfortable with that decision, but he embraced it, he supported it. He then would move on to pass the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And those of you who say, well, I don't believe it, I don't think Ike liked Earl Warren, and I don't think that he liked Brown versus Board, I give you Little Rock. In 1957, Eisenhower sent federal troops into Little Rock, Arkansas to compel the governor of that state to allow 9 Black students to enroll in Little Rock High School in September of 1957. He didn't want to do that. It killed him. It tore him up inside to do that. He used federal forces. It fulfilled every prognostication of the Southerners, where men with bayonets would come and force integration. And he said, I don't care. I'm going to take, maybe they're going to hate me for it, but it's the law. So, he was always uncomfortable in this role. And I think that's part of the paradox and the contradiction of Eisenhower. But for me, it remains one of the most biggest surprises of his presidency and maybe perhaps the most enduring accomplishment.
Of course, Eisenhower governed at a time that was a lot less partisan than what we see today. But how did he manage partisanship? How did he deal with that? I mean, here's a very successful general who probably didn't get a ton of disagreement when he was a general, but then he becomes president and you get lots of criticism.
Yeah, I mean, what I would like to be able to say is that Eisenhower was what we know was a figure who didn't see partisanship and represented the nation instead of his political party and so forth. That's certainly what he believed the presidency was all about. He wasn't that comfortable in the role of party leader. And so partisanship, in some ways, partisanship didn't come naturally to him. On the other hand, let's not underestimate that Eisenhower was a man of strong political views, and we can see in the early days when he was thinking about running for president, he was honing a message in 1948, 1949, 1950. When he's president of Columbia, he's thinking about running. A lot of people, his friends, are pushing him, and he gives hundreds of speeches. And in those speeches, we hear a true conservative. We hear him say, "The New Deal is socialism." We hear him say, "If government gets too big, it will be like a dictatorship, and we'll be just like the Soviets." Now, I'm not sure that he really believed all these things because he didn't govern this way when he became president. But he was trying to find his political voice. He was trying to find his message. And he started with what amounted to a very sharp critique of the Democrats, of Roosevelt and the Truman legacy. And this unfortunately poisoned his relations with Harry Truman. When Eisenhower became, by the time Eisenhower became president, he and Truman were not on speaking terms. So they had fought, over personal matters, over matters of style, over the question of loyalty to George Marshall and how to deal with McCarthy and so on. But at the same time, it was Eisenhower's criticism of the legacy of the Democrats and Truman's rebuttals. So he started out as a partisan, And I would say that over the course of his 8 years, he realized that that was not always the most effective way to govern America in the 1950s, that some degree of bipartisanship was important. But I hasten to add that he wanted to build the Republican Party in his own image. He wanted a moderate GOP, and he failed in that goal. And I say that not because that's my judgment, that was his judgment. He was consistently foiled in trying to find Ike Jr. He had dozens of people that he was thinking about, and then he would turn to Nixon and he would say, you're not it either. He couldn't find the successor. And I think it bothered him a great deal that he couldn't nudge the Republican Party. In fact, the Republican Party did very poorly at congressional elections during his 8 years in office. And instead, it was Nixon who lost in 1960, and then Goldwater. And Goldwater took the party in a very different direction Ike was very uncomfortable with. So I'd like to say that he was a nonpartisan figure, but the reality is he was actually a partisan who wasn't always very good at being partisan, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. You've been painting a largely glowing picture of Eisenhower as president. Let's go to the other side a little bit. Talk about some of the flaws that you point out in your book.
Yeah, gosh. Well, I mean, there are plenty, and we can talk about them. In the book, I don't sort of line up the greatest hits and then say, here's 3 things that were bad. I try to integrate them all because I think it's only fair that we write presidential history with a great deal of empathy for the difficulty of the job. I mean, as a historian, it's my role to be a critic and to evaluate their role and their behavior. But it's so difficult to be president. You constantly make mistakes and errors of judgment, and sometimes it's just the nature of the job. Nobody's perfect. No presidency is unmarred. But I do think there are a couple of errors of judgment that I think he could easily have avoided. And I hinted at McCarthy and McCarthyism, and I do think that's worth discussing. Running for president in 1952, Eisenhower wasn't quite sure what to make of Joe McCarthy. McCarthy was himself running for re-election in that year. Ike was kind of new to the game. He saw McCarthy. He didn't like him. He didn't like his demagoguery. He didn't like him personally at all. But he also realized that McCarthy had something, which was a political edge. He had a bite to him. He was rallying the base. And Eisenhower knew he needed some of that base to support him. He knew he'd have the moderates for him, but he wanted the conservatives. He wanted the anti-communists. So he campaigned in Wisconsin alongside McCarthy. And this is a man who had criticized his great mentor, George Marshall, had criticized him repeatedly, called him a traitor, a conspiracy so immense that George Marshall is at the heart of losing China. You know the story. It was just a horrible outrage that Joe McCarthy would have said these things about George Marshall. And it was a puzzle then, and it's a puzzle now why Eisenhower wasn't a more full-throated critic of McCarthy and why he appeared with him during the campaign while in the state of Wisconsin. You might think that was just a mistake of the campaign trail. Hey, it's politics. Everybody gets gets dirty a little bit during the campaign. But even in the first 2 years of his presidency, he didn't confront McCarthy in the way that his friends wanted him to do. And this is a subject that we could talk about all night. Why didn't he do more? Some people feel that he did a great deal behind the scenes to undermine Joe McCarthy, to give him enough rope to hang himself, if you like. Others say he did nothing and just tried to avoid getting tarnished. I think the truth is somewhere in between. I think he did play a role in undermining and hurting McCarthy by releasing various documents that were embarrassing to McCarthy. But the reality is he did not use the power of his office to confront this senator directly. He should have done. But he felt, look, McCarthy's a popular Republican. I'm the leader of the party. McCarthy's got allies in the Senate. He's got Taft, and then he's got Nolan and so forth. I can't go right at him. So he made a tactical political judgment when I think he should have made a moral judgment. And that's just where I am. And I think people are going to disagree about that. I'll stop there because you may want to raise other questions, but that's one big one. Another question we could talk a little bit more about is Nixon. Was Nixon the right man for the vice presidency? Eisenhower made Richard Nixon. Without Ike, there is no President Nixon. Was that the right judgment? Again, Eisenhower didn't make the call. Nixon was put on the ticket largely by committee, but he should have made the call. He should have done his due diligence. He should have known more about who Nixon was and where he was going. He lost confidence in Nixon, in my view, very early on in his presidency. And I think it was a mistake to leave him on the ticket in 1956. So those are two political errors, and there are a few others, but I won't go on because I know that you probably have more questions. It's just I get so excited about it because these are issues that look wrong to us now, but remember, at the time, Eisenhower had his reasons for these decisions, and I think that's the role of the historian, is to empathize with what were the available choices at the moment.
Did Eisenhower establish a model for being president?
Did he establish a model that he wanted others to follow? Yes. I mean, I think so. I think it's a very in some ways idealistic model, in other ways perhaps a model that could only have worked for his time. I mean, it was a model, in my view, of again, a highly disciplined, military style bureaucracy around him. The White House is still very small in the 1950s. We have to remember that the institution of the office of the White House has gotten so enormous. But Eisenhower was still, governing at a time when the apparatus of government in the White House and the executive office was still relatively manageable. Eisenhower was a detail man. He didn't micromanage, but he sure knew the briefs of all of the cabinet members. And here I get back to a point I made earlier, his intelligence. He knew the subjects. I mean, I know that I'm sounding like a hagiography, but he really did know the subjects that most of his cabinet officers were in charge of as well, or maybe even better than they did, which may be an issue of who he had appointed, but nonetheless, he was often the smartest guy in the room. I call it the discipline presidency because he had a systematic approach to everything, which was you've got to meet with the cabinet once a week. You've got to have a press conference once a week, a press conference once a week with the press in a give and take. You've got to meet with members of Congress, both parties once a week. You've got to meet with the National Security Council once a week, and he did that. So he left a legacy of organization, discipline, focus. I think that's one. The other model that he was inspired by was the notion of a kind of George Washington. I mean, I know that sounds childish almost, who wouldn't be, inspired by George Washington, but the ideal that he carried was that the president should be a figure who unites the country rather than only governs on behalf of one half or the other, one party or the other. He didn't always do that, but I think he aspired to that role. Certainly it's part of the reason that Eisenhower remains as popular as he is today. Whether he achieved that, I don't know. But if you compare that role with the combativeness and the disorganization, I would say, of Harry Truman. Everyone loves Harry Truman, especially in Kansas City. But Harry Truman was disorganized and he was super partisan. So in many ways, he was the opposite of Ike. So the two of them make a kind of good study in contrast. And of course, Roosevelt, a genius, brilliant, so incredibly talented, so successful in so many ways, but also a very unreliable, non-opaque, difficult figure to understand, non-transparent, never really told a full truth, full stop once in his life. So Ike was the opposite of all of that. And whether that's successful politically, I'm not so sure. But I do think it meant that the country, to use a phrase from the Washington Post of the era, the country was having a love affair with Dwight Eisenhower, overwhelmingly the most popular president of the post-war era.
Let me ask you about something the chancellor said, Professor. You were asked to be part of the dedication of the Eisenhower Memorial recently. That was a tremendous honor. How did you feel about that?
That's a great question, and thanks for asking it. It's a wonderful achievement, and I'll just I'll put it this way, and I hope that my remarks are take them in stride. Look, I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. And right now in this country, there's a big argument going on about statues. Should we have statues? Should we have statues to men, old white men? Is it a good thing? Should we erect these statues to honor these men? And my views about this have changed. And I have started to realize that statues do a certain kind of political work at a particular moment in time. And not everybody is going to see a statue the same way. We have to understand the messages that these monuments are designed, in many cases, to project. So the stakes are actually very high. It's not just about, well, I like that guy, I'd like a statue to him. It's about what choices are we as a country making when we put up a monument to a president or a civil rights leader or whoever it may be, a soldier. So I just want to say that I think the stakes are heightened now more than ever. So as we cut the ribbon on a new statue, it's actually a number of statues. It's a substantial memorial to Eisenhower as a man and as a person and as a leader. I think we ought to be aware of, not just that we like Ike, but what are we saying? What values are we representing? And I think that the memorial does a pretty darn good job of projecting Eisenhower's values. So it shows him signing the Civil Rights Act of 1957 in one picture. Over on the other side, there's Eisenhower as the military leader talking to the airborne troops just as they're about to embark on the airborne operations on June 6, 1944. So we see him in a pose of as a soldier and as a civilian leader. We also see him as a little boy from Kansas thinking about his future, and we see the backdrop of the Normandy coastline. Taken as a whole, a lot of people criticize the design, but taken as a whole, what I think it does is it represents complexity. It represents change over time, a man who grew up from nothing and who became so influential. I think it reminds us about, the path that he traveled, the path the country traveled between 1890 when he was born and the end of the 1960s. So if it does any of those things, it will succeed. If it forces us to reflect on history as in its complexity, it will succeed. If it's only one-dimensional, then I don't know that we will succeed. And at the end of the day, we won't know until the students from the University of Kansas and the University of Virginia and all of our great institutions, when they go there, what did they see? Then we'll know if it's worked or not.
I have one final question, Professor. So if you're in the audience and you have a question for Professor Will Hitchcock about his book, The Age of Eisenhower, you can go ahead and submit that through the chat function on the YouTube channel. And just to remind everybody, you can get the professor's book from the KU bookstore. All the instructions are right there online. So be a great Christmas present. Christmas is coming up, so be a great Christmas present. But if you do have a question, go ahead and send that question along, and we'll get to them in just a moment. But my final question, Will, is we have a very active student culture at the Dole Institute, and obviously a lot of students on campus. But what would you say to our students, but students all across the country, about the importance of knowing and studying history and how that affects their careers and their attitudes about life and those kinds of things?
Gosh, that's a wonderful question, and thank you for asking it. So I'll say, of course, first of all, history is immensely fun because it allows you to figure out how you got where you are. You find out your own story by studying history. Who's your family? How did you get here? Wherever here is. Who are you? Those are the questions that all of us are always interested in. And history is a window into answering the most important sort of question we all have about ourselves. Who am I? How did I get here? But the thing that I teach my students, what I tell them when I say, what is history? And some people say, well, it's kind of what happened. What I tell them is that's not really what it is. History is about making arguments. It's about interpreting documents and the evidence and building up what you think happened. So what I think is so empowering about studying history is that each individual person who wants to study history has the opportunity to look at the sources, to look at the evidence, and decide for him or herself, what does it mean? And in that way, you are, given this extraordinary gift of being able to say, here's what I see when I look at the evidence. Here's what I see when I look at Dwight Eisenhower. I don't see him at all the way you do. And so we have an argument. We have, and I mean that in the best possible sense, a conversation about what's important in the past. That's the way to figure out who we are today, is we have got to accept that there are differing views about the past. If we can accept that, we can also accept that there are differing views about the present, and that's okay. civil discourse is about seeing things from multiple points of view. That's what history is about. So it is in some way a language of civic discourse. If we're going to be, if we're going to figure out how to make our political system work, we have to be able to disagree civilly. That's what historians do all day long. We disagree civilly and we come back and say, well, I have more evidence. I want to keep the conversation going. So students, study history. It's not the boring stuff that you were cramming for in high school. It is an empowering discipline to allow you to ask questions and develop arguments.
Very, very good. Our first question tonight, Professor, is from Patricia. She asks, and this is a good question, can you talk a little bit about the process involved with your research for the book?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Patricia. There's no real, I wish there was a magic bullet. There isn't. First of all, you read a great deal of what other historians have already written. I think the most important thing for the historian is to recognize that you're coming into this following the work of a lot of smart people. And you have to respect their work because they worked hard at it, and they might be wrong, they might be right, but you need to know what they said. So reading other people's work first, and there's a lot written about Eisenhower. But then immediately you've got to go to the documents. Now, every modern presidents have these wonderful presidential libraries. There's a terrific one in Abilene devoted to Eisenhower, and there are many others for subsequent presidents. And so, there's a huge amount of material there. How do you begin? Where would you begin? Well, I decided that I wanted to both do a chronological story of his presidency, but I also wanted each chapter to be thematic so that it was mostly focused on civil rights or foreign policy or, covert operations in the CIA. So I would go to the archives and I would search mostly for civil rights materials or mostly for CIA materials. I'd bring them home and I would spend, it could be 6 to 12 months working on just one chapter. And, if you're not in it for the long haul, then writing a history book is probably not for you, because it does take a long time to build your knowledge base. And over time, I began to see patterns. I began to feel like I knew Ike and his people, and I started to feel confident. And that's when the writing really can begin. So I wish there was a shortcut, but at least when you're dealing with a president who is a public figure and who the presidency creates so much paper, so much evidence, there's really no easy way through.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. Now I have a follow-up, but I just want to encourage folks to go ahead, go to the chat function, send in your questions if you have them for the professor. But my follow-up is, how long did you actually spend writing this book from the point you conceived it to the point where you submitted the manuscript?
Yes, well, it was about 8 years, and I will say that I wasn't working on it every day. I moved jobs from one university to another, and you always lose time doing that. I was chairman of a department briefly, and that slowed me down. But I picked up the pace towards the end, and the last couple of years were probably when I wrote half of the book. But again, it's about critical mass. If you spend a lot of time in the archives, you feel like you've read everything, you feel like you've seen enough documents, at some point you're ready to write. And that part can go relatively fast. So all that spade work that you do up front really pays off in the end, because you're more confident in your judgments and your interpretations as you move along. But so much paper comes across the president's desk, and as a historian, you have to decide which ones you're going to write about, because you can't write about them all. And this is where, as I say, the business about arguments, interpretation, suddenly you think, who am I to decide what was important in the 1950s? What piece of paper on Eisenhower's desk was important? And the answer is, I'm a historian, and anybody can do this. I mean, each of us has the ability and the right to interpret the presidency or any other topic by looking at the evidence fairly and deciding what to make of it. So I never got bored. I mean, it's exhausting, but it's an uplifting process, feeling like, you're engaging with some of the most significant issues and significant people of the past.
Okay, Tyler asks, Senator Dole regards President Eisenhower as one of his heroes. What qualities do you believe are the most impactful from Ike's life and decisions to people like Senator Bob Dole?
Well, I don't want to speak for him, of course, or indeed many many of the people who are on this seminar discussion who know Senator Dole's legacy better than I do, but of course, they both share a common commitment, a lifelong commitment to public service, both in the military and in politics. And I think that's a relatively, that's a pretty small club. And, a lot of professional politicians who maybe didn't serve in the military, maybe figured out how to avoid serving in the military, even if they should have, even if their generation was engaged, they weren't. We're now at a time when there is starting to be an upward tick in public service of people who have served in the military, because our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have brought veterans into the political sphere. So the numbers in Congress have started to turn up after a significant dip. But serving in the military, and of course, suffering in war, as Senator Dole did, and yet coming out the other side uncynical, optimistic, believing in your country, willing to spend your time in public service, giving back. You have to be built a certain way. You have to be wired a certain way to have that calling. And it's not for everybody. And I don't think that it's easy, but I do think that's probably the thing that connects Senator Dole and Dwight Eisenhower in ways that probably many of us could only imagine.
Here's another question from David. Getting a lot of good questions from the audience tonight. Given that we're in a campaign season, I'm curious what Eisenhower thought of his campaign. How does the commanding general deal with "I like Ike"?
Well, I think he liked that part about it. I mean, he complained about this what they used to call this, the salesmanship, the soft soap, whatever. He didn't like having to give little clips on the TV. He used advertising, in his first campaign, which was the first time that had been done, televised advertising. He had to sell himself like he was selling a box of cereal. He didn't particularly like that, but he turned out to be pretty good at it. The "I like Ike" stuff, I mean, Eisenhower, here's just a little wrinkle. Eisenhower had more charisma, more physical, presence than we can ever tell by looking at photographs, like black and white photographs of him. We read about this all the time. So he was a natural on the campaign trail. Energetic, beaming. He had a sort of ruddy, flushed complexion, big hands. He loved going into a crowd. I mean, he was so popular. He loved all that kind of adulation. He didn't love giving the speeches. He didn't love the partisanship, the nastiness of it. But Eisenhower had a pretty big ego. And I think when he began to realize that he was just absolutely venerated in the country in 1952 and again 1956, it was a great thing for him. 1956, he barely campaigned. I mean, he gave about 12 speeches. He was ill, for one thing, and he was dealing with a major foreign policy crisis and the Suez crisis. But he was, reelected by an overwhelming margin in 1956. So campaigns were so much shorter then. My goodness, I mean, you don't blink or you miss it. Now they people never stop campaigning.
And we may be campaigning well into December. We don't know right now. But Ken asked, did Eisenhower try to make Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, believe he might be willing to use nuclear weapons?
Oh yes, Eisenhower was believed in what we might call, in a jargony kind of way, domesticating nuclear weapons. That is, to make nuclear weapons look plausible, look like any other munition. And he believed this. He told people in private this. He told his commanders this, and he told the public this: that if we ever got into a war, it would probably go nuclear, because that was the only way to win it. And that's something that I think a lot of people tended to discount, like, you can't be serious. But Eisenhower was dead serious about the possible use of nuclear weapons. Mind you, he didn't mean bombing the whole world and everybody on it, but what he really meant was using a range of nuclear weapons, some of which could be, as we might call them, tactical nuclear weapons. He thought about it. He would have used them in Taiwan, the Taiwan Straits crisis against China. He, with respect to Khrushchev, not quite so much Khrushchev, because he was actually trying to court Khrushchev. He was trying to soften the Cold War. He invited Khrushchev to come to the United States. They met at Camp David. Khrushchev had this absolutely goofy 10-day trip across the United States, which was actually very, very popular, and it sort of softened the Cold War briefly. But Eisenhower built the nuclear deterrent in order for it to be used if it ever had to be. I mean, this is what is, again, one of these contradictions. He wanted peace, he wanted deterrence, but he said the only way to have deterrence is to make a nuclear deterrent that is usable and to tell the world that we'll use it. And I think he would have used it in a couple of key cases. Berlin and Formosa are the two where I think it might have come to a nuclear exchange.
Okay, Patricia asks, can you talk a little bit about Eisenhower's personal life, his marriages, children, lifestyle, etc.?
Yes, I can. I mean, he as was common in the early part of the century, Eisenhower and his wife Mamie Eisenhower lost their first son to scarlet fever in early 1921. He was 3 years old when he died, and he never really overcame the loss. And how could he have? It's something that that he shared with many of the great leaders. Winston Churchill also lost a child. Charles de Gaulle. It's just one of those things that people faced and endured. I think it just, he wrote movingly about that loss as something was the greatest. He called it the greatest disaster of his life. His marriage to Mamie, Susan Eisenhower has written a wonderful book about this, and I recommend it to you. Mamie was a very dynamic personality. Some days she loved the spotlight. Other days she didn't. She could be withdrawn, but she could also be ebullient. The way I viewed it was she was a great partner for him. She was an incredibly helpful personality in building his reputation when Eisenhower was a young Army officer. And Mamie did all the work of entertaining and networking and building those friendships and sustaining those friendships. That's the kind of work that always goes unnoticed and uncredited, but she was very good at it. She poured her life into his career in a very literal sense, and did so as First Lady. His son John, went to West Point, and I think was overwhelmed by the pressure of being Eisenhower's son. He became an important, distinguished military historian, but it was difficult to be the son of the greatest figure of the middle of part of the 20th century. And I don't, of course, how could anyone, not sympathize with that? Would have been difficult. But he loved his grandchildren. He retired at Gettysburg. He gave them pony rides. Susan Eisenhower has just written a wonderful book called How Ike Led, and it talks about her relationship to her grandfather. And it's just very moving. And I think he was bigger than life, but at the same time, he was a very, a very real person in their lives. And some people say, oh, he had an affair, et cetera, et cetera. I just push that all aside. I don't think that's the real Ike. I think the real Ike he was an incredibly devoted family man, and sometimes a little bit difficult because he was kind of intimidating.
Okay, Tyler asked, do you believe we have, this is a great question for a historian, I think you'll like this. Do you believe we have the definitive overview of Eisenhower's presidency today, or do you believe that there are still documents that are yet to be declassified that might yield new perspectives?
Great question. There are definitely still documents. Now, if you go to the Eisenhower Library, they say, look, we've got, and I can't remember what the number was, 250,000 documents, something like that, that still haven't been declassified. And it's not because they're sitting on them like and guarding them. It's just that in order to declassify documents once they're classified, in many cases, you have to ask for them. So researchers need to go to Abilene and file the request so that these things will be declassified. Many of them deal with a nuclear deterrent, so they would have been classified because of national security, or the juiciest ones, and they may not be very many, but I think they'll still be revealing. We'll deal with covert operations in the CIA. I myself saw a number of things that had only just been declassified with respect to American covert operations in the Congo. When the United States was trying to participate in an overthrow of a government there. And some of those records are really only quite recently available. The same thing is true, believe it or not, of Cuba. You'd think everything had been released about Cuba, but we're only coming to, just recently are we finding out more about the depths of American covert operations in Cuba. There are all kinds of military planning documents. So those of you who are interested in foreign policy and military policy from the 50s onward, all sorts of things there. So I urge you to, go to Abilene or just call them, get online and say, I want to see if you have anything on the space race or, the U-2 spy plane and so forth. And you'll be amazed at the treasures that are still to be unearthed.
Well, I want to thank you tonight. It's been especially entertaining and educational about one of Kansas's great historical figures. So thanks for joining us virtually as part of the Dole Institute.
Oh, hey, this was my pleasure. I can't believe we're already done, and I probably talked too much, but I really enjoy it. Love the chance to talk about Eisenhower, and you're very kind to have had me. And the Dole Institute is just doing such important work and fostering civil discourse. Keep it up. I hope I'll get to join you in person sometime soon.
Oh, I think that'd be great. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. On a personal note, tomorrow is Ike's birthday. My father also shares General Eisenhower's birthday. So happy 90th birthday, Dad. And to everyone who joined us tonight, thank you for joining us. And thanks for all the great audience questions. We look forward to seeing you at our next program. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this evening. If you are a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Join us next week for the second installment of the Conversation on Race program series on Wednesday, October 21st at 7 p.m. You can access this program on the Dole Institute's YouTube channel, just like tonight's program. Refer to doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all of our upcoming programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, consider becoming a friend of the Dole Institute by donating to help make programs like this possible. We hope you enjoyed this evening's program. Thank you and good night.